Hey, Philip.
Hey, Peter.
How's it going, man?
Going pretty good.
Cool, cool.
Mhm.
All right. We have two people signed up today. One asking about custom agent. Forgot what the other person was asking about. I think it was just had like a generic authorization comment.
Okay.
But I think they also signed up last week and didn't show up. So we'll see.
All right.
Cool.
I'll take a look at that new Rego cheat sheet while we wait.
Yeah, and like the cheat sheet, I think is gonna be a fun one.
Mhm.
Like I kind of just have a lot of stuff in here, and I'm thinking that probably with Isabella, I can like maybe divide this up into maybe two or three smaller cheat sheets.
Mhm.
Yeah. So yeah, so each of the things on the in the index on the left, that's like the high level. Those are I'm just going to add like examples. So anything that has like an H4 where it's like indented in means that
Yeah.
those are
Yeah.
like the examples that I'm putting in.
Okay. I'll go to list of all the keywords.
Yeah, and kind of like I just yeah I think like this is just going to be like a quick like looking down from above
Mhm.
like how do I just like giving quick information more than anything else, more than like
Mhm.
otherwise just like go to the docs.
Yeah. I do think there are some parts of the docs that could probably be reorganized a bit in order to make it easier to find stuff, but uh, a comprehensive reorganization takes a long time to figure out how you really want to do it. What's the best way to arrange the information for the people using it? Because, like, my needs are going to be different than the average person, trying to get started with Rego. So,
Yeah, and I think the current organization strategy where it's not very clear for someone who's like new, right? Like it's like, oh, what's the difference between like policy language and policy reference, right? And it's just like
yeah,
because like you have rules listed in
yeah,
both and cover something slightly different in each. But if I'm just trying to learn about rules, I don't know to look in both places. And so it's yeah, like I think our docs are very well covered and detailed, but
yeah.
yeah, like we would need someone who's like done a professional information architecture redesign before, because like I look at that, it's like there's so much here. I don't even know where to start.
I remember this was something at All Things Open 22 that they had, goodness, two or three talks that I saw that were entirely about that kind of thing of like, are your docs really working for you? And I kind of attended one of those talks and was just sitting there the whole time wondering, they kind of work, but they could work better. Um, and so, yeah, I am not a professional, information architecture person. I write code most of the day, but I do think that the distinction you brought up there, policy language versus policy reference, is a good one. Of yeah, how do we distinguish that? Because inevitably everyone ends up on the reference page looking at the built-ins list at some point, right?
Yeah, and
So
I think there's a very subtle differentiator that we use where it's like, oh, the language is like explaining it's like the Merriam-Webster, like let me tell you the definition, and the reference is supposed to have examples.
yeah,
But I don't know, like you could literally smash them all together and it wouldn't it would make it longer, but it's already really long. It doesn't like going from long to really long doesn't change the effect to the consumer.
yeah, I don't know what the best solution is there, but that's something that in the new year might be fun to look at. Is Do we want to attempt a great docs reorganization? Um,
Yeah, I did it at a previous company with docs like
mhm.
1/4 the size of this, like at best, and it still took weeks.
Yeah, no, because it's a comprehensive change and it affects everything. So one
Yeah.
one thing though that might fall out of a docs change and a reorganization of things is the Algolia search that we have. They're like docs search thing
Mhm.
that's free, latches incredibly strongly onto headers and stuff. It's not actually a full text search,
Mhm.
which is something that has proven to be a problem in the past. I've run into people trying to do like embedded like Golang Rego stuff, and they Google like very specific terms that do appear in the code samples in the docs, but because Algolia doesn't do a full text indexing, they actually can't find the page they're after, and they have to root around manually to find the page, which I don't know that there's a great way around that other than generating, like if Algolia lets us provide keyword mappings, we might be able to generate that manually, but that's
Yeah,
kind of kludgy, right?
as far as I know, the free version is very limited. And so it's like all the other options are like paid options. So it's nice that there is a free version. But yeah,
Yeah,
they're kind of like, if you want to do anything, you have to pay us. And then the jump to the first tier is like insane.
I believe it. Yeah. Like free search is better than no search, but
Yeah.
I wonder like what other alternatives are out there because the lack of full text search has definitely bitten me before.
Yeah.
Um,
I wonder if there's like an open source like search thing.
there has to be. And it's a matter of like, are we able to find it and does it plug into the stuff that we're using right now?
Yeah, like I feel like
So
the docs and like the open source website of like are slowly falling into disrepair. And they're two things that need, yeah, like
it's it's a good strong architecture we've got to be able to put stuff in,
mhm.
but it could always be better. Um, so I wouldn't say complete disrepair. Like we do maintain it, and when new features go in, they get documented. But the question is, can anyone find those new things? So
Yeah, so maybe disrepair is the wrong word there, but yeah, it is becoming unruly at some point. Like we need to pull it
unruly
all
is a
back.
great word.
Yeah.
I if we're compiling a wish list, like one of my big wish list items would be cross-linking the change log to the docs.
Yeah, that'd be
Does that make
nice.
sense? Because
Yeah, it
that
totally
would
does.
be it would be super cool to be able to see like, oh yeah, this new feature, here's the thing on that, right? And then cross-link it. It would be a bit more work to do, at least initially. So we might do that just going forward. But um that could be an interesting way to kind of cross-link the two more, or just embed the change log in the docs like the Python guys do, where it's just that's one of their pages. It's just, hey, here's our change log.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I could definitely see that with like the drop down that we have where you like select a version and just like the
mhm.
top page is always just yeah, the change log. Like and just like you just get everything there and you know, like, oh, this
Yeah,
might have disappeared because of this.
right, right. Don't know. There's a million different ways it could be done. Most of them are okay. The question is, what one of the things that I remember from ATO and the talks there though was like figuring out who actually uses your software and what are they trying to get out of your docs particularly, because there's often several different personas that each need different things. And so
Mhm.
in our case we have this weird mix between policy authors, low level Golang hackery, and people trying to figure out what the heck is OPA and how do I deploy it, right? And there's like at least 3 or 4 different personas in there.
Those are three good buckets. And like, yeah, like I think the only one that I ever really pay attention to is like the I'm just trying to figure out what OPA is.
Hmm.
Just like in but I do agree those other groups do exist. And I don't think they're negligible. I think like they
Yeah,
like there's a decent number of them. But yeah, the only one that's ever like in my brain is like, oh, the person that I just met at KubeCon that hasn't used this
right.
before. How do I get
Yeah.
them started in 20 minutes? And then
Mhm.
right, because that's always the like when you're playing for awareness, and then
Right.
once you have the awareness, and then they're like, oh, I spent an hour and I still don't even have an OPA up. They're just like, oh yeah, that's a bad experience.
Yeah. Yeah. No, nobody likes having to do a huge amount of configuration before they can go.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I remember much earlier in my career, me trying to set up a MySQL database instance for the first time and getting really confused and scared, like, oh gosh, I have to do all this extra configuration. I think it's better now. Like the tutorials on the internet are better now than they were then, but
They
it
are, but
was
that
it was deeply intimidating that I had to do like all this configuration, and if I get it wrong, there might be consequences, you know?
yeah, I remember that. I remember like the MySQL server like taking like this 5 page configuration document, and it's like and like whoever gave it to you is like, don't change anything on this. You're just like, okay.
Yep, yep. So, I don't want us to be that. Like we have tons of config options, but where possible,
Yeah.
we should probably try to steer towards defaults so that people don't have to do all the config. I think we've been okay on that so far. Um, there's a lot
Yeah.
of cases where like backwards compatibility ties our hands, but what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I think the other thing that like I think about a lot is we have two educational problems. One is like OPA ops. How do you actually run and deploy and manage like the operation side? And then there's
Yeah,
also learning Rego, right? These are two different educational pieces that have to tie
right.
into each other. And so, right, because
Yeah,
and I don't know like where that crossover junction works. Like the playground is good for teaching Rego, and then
yeah,
we need something different to teach the ops stuff. And then
yeah.
you have to find some way to like tie them back together. Because in like yeah,
Because it's I think of it now as kind of like Rego is the programming language, and OPA
mhm,
just happens to be the runtime environment that provides a bunch of security related built-ins and stuff, right? If
yeah,
you think of it that way, where it is a programming environment, or sorry, a programming language with a runtime around it that makes it really good for security, it's a case where we have, yeah, two educational problems all in one. We're having to teach
mhm,
people about the operational side of the runtime thing, you know, OPA.
mhm.
Um, and we're also having to teach them a new programming language simultaneously, which is it's a little harder, right? Because it's two problems in one. They're closely related, but
Yeah, and then where it's tricky, like it's very easy to teach like the very simple, like, oh, this is how you start the server and this is how you write your first rule. But then all of a sudden, when you need to start teaching configuration, like the crossover between the two becomes, very intertwined. And you're just like, oh, right, the configuration lives in the runtime side, but it's very much going to affect what you're doing while you're writing Rego. And
yeah,
so, yeah, there's a point where it gets really tricky.
I almost wish we had done the C++ approach of having like year version for languages, where you say, yeah, I want to be in C++ 11 mode. Let's go GCC. And then, just have an OPA 22 version, OPA 21, or I guess Rego 21, right?
Yeah, yeah.
There is a certain, in my opinion, there's a certain virtue to the idea that you just have discrete versions of the language, and you live with the sins you committed in earlier versions, and you try to fix it later. um, I will say it is interesting that we have the level of backwards compatibility that we do, because it does make it possible to migrate really, really huge version jumps really fast. But it also has caused a couple problems, like the not keyword is one of my favorites,
Mhm.
where there's a lot of legacy around why it works the way it does. And it's kind of confusing sometimes, and you can't use it everywhere yet. Um, and we can't really get rid of its behavior because somebody might have built a rule that depends on it. And if we just suddenly change its behavior overnight to work like the not keyword does in Python, you know where it's basically just a Boolean thing, that actually really could subtly break someone's policy in a horrible way. And so we are hamstrung a bit in changing that right now. And it's kind of that's one thing that, like, if I could break any one backwards compatibility thing in OPA, that's probably the one I'd pick right now, would be that one, just to make the language cleaner. But
and that's an interesting one, like how tightly we're holding to that backwards compatibility thing, being that
like,
we're
it's
not at
important.
version, well, we're not at version 1 yet, right?
Right.
It's just so it's like, but we're acting like we're post version 1, and so I think that's good in some, in a lot of cases, right? You shouldn't go crazy with the like, but I mean, we're also right pre version 1. Like if we were at version
Yeah.
1, I would say like, oh yeah, no, like not is locked in, like that is the
Yeah.
functionality. But I'm kind of like, I think with enough notice, like in 4 versions, we're changing this thing or something.
Right. So that's one of the things I remember, when I came on the OPA team at Styra, was like, what is our deprecation policy? Do we have one? I see things are deprecated, but they never go away, you know? And currently the rough heuristic is like, give it about a year-ish. The problem though is I have looked in the code base. I have looked for things that were supposed to be officially deprecated. They have not been deprecated. Or more accurately, they're marked deprecated. So if you try to do stuff through the Golang interfaces, you get yelled at by the Go compiler. But like the code's still there. For stuff in Rego though that's supposedly been deprecated, we just leave it. And the reasoning that I've heard for that so far is mainly backwards compatibility and helping with migrations, where people don't have a lot of time and they need to upgrade quickly and they just want it to work, and they'll fix it later, maybe, possibly.
They won't.
Right? I know most of them won't. But again, like there is a certain virtue in keeping backwards compatibility. One thing that I have spent a good bit of thought on as a way to kind of, pick a middle path, is the Python community had an absolutely horrible migration between Python 2 to Python 3, right? It took years for the community to finally glacially shift over to Python 3 and all that, right? So over the course of that, one of the important tools that came up in their community early on was the 2 to 3 script, literally named, the number 2,
Oh yeah.
3, yeah. And it would do a bunch of, rote translation between Python 2-isms to Python 3-isms, right? Like the print keyword became a function in Python 3. It went from a keyword to a function. And so they would just automatically refactor that with that script, and they would give you like a diff of what it would look like with, those lines replaced. And I think for Rego, if we wanted to make it easier to deprecate things in the future, having a tool like that that's either like part of OPA and understands the different like language versions as we go along, or an external tool, maintained by the community that understands like, this is what was in version 45, but now the not keyword works differently in version 55. Having a tool that can do like automated refactoring and migration, and gives you either like an explanation of why it did it, or at least gives you like a diff so you can see what it's going to do before it does it. Like a 2 to 3 style tool would, in my opinion, make it a lot easier to do migrations, because then you can deprecate things and change behavior a bit more aggressively, and people still have a way to make it all work.
Yeah, I wonder if that's something that could be tacked on to like the strict mode checks, where it's like in strict mode, right? We are looking for things that have been deprecated, but kind of like still work.
Yeah.
And so like, what if we added there, like, oh, this got turned off, right? Maybe this would help you, right? Maybe not a full translation, but at least like this doesn't exist because this exists, right? At least a nudge in the right direction. You're using not, but probably you want to do this instead now.
Yeah. So things like that have been on my mind for a bit of like, we've done a really good job of backwards compatibility so far, but it is actively hampering some things we would like to do with the language. what could we do differently? You know, if we wanted to introduce new syntax, how do we make that be nice?
Yeah, and it adds confusion, like in like the refs in the head, which I think is a cool feature. But yeah,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of things that you have to work around to make it so you don't break our previous usage of the dot notations into objects. And so I'm just like,
Mhm.
oh, that added a lot of complexity into my brain of like how when you're reading Rego, you're like, oh, but it only works this way in these conditions. Okay. So it's like it's like too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the refs in the head change was an overall like needed and good change.
Mhm.
Makes the language more powerful, right? Easier to, well, maybe not easier to write, but definitely more concise once you have the model in your head for how you should be writing it. Um, but yeah, it did add a lot of complexity. I just remember that PR was absolutely horrifying. The sheer scale of it. It is the single biggest chunk of code I have ever had to review. It was a good time. uh,
Yeah.
Overall,
And
though, like I was surprised. Like we did ultimately, like Stefan managed to get that one to a point where it was not going to horribly break everything, and was a surprisingly comprehensive, like top to bottom change in the docs and everywhere else of everything. Um, yeah,
yeah,
I don't
and
know.
nothing blew up after we pushed it, which was nice.
It took a good I was surprised. It took several weeks before we started getting actual reports of anything blowing up on account of that. And it was like
Yeah.
minor stuff, really
Yeah.
minor. To where like people could still get their work done, but there was like this one, you know, edge case kind of thing. And that I consider to be like annoying, but like we did our due diligence. Nothing major blew up.
Yeah.
Everything world continued spinning for normal OPA users, and yeah, it's what we want.
Yeah, most definitely. I think it was a good addition to like everything that we're able to do.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, like I think one of the things about the Rego language is that there's so many subtleties, right? Like when you're
Yeah,
making a comprehension, like whether making a set, array, or object, it's just dependent on like, oh, just like the brackets. And when you're new, you don't realize that like you might not even notice bracket versus squiggly bracket, and you're just like, oh, but makes a completely different thing. And so the
yeah,
outcome is very, and so like, and same with like the rule heads, where it's like, oh yeah, it's like, oh, this means a function. This means they all look nearly identical to a new user.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, those are things I'm hoping I think hoping like the cheat sheet will make those like very clear. Yeah.
That's one more thing that like if I had like, you know, a couple of language change tokens that I could spend, one of the
Mhm.
tokens I would spend would be making functions work the way that you think they work in like Python. So first class functions as like
Okay.
something you could pass in as an argument to another function or a built-in or right. Currently, we don't have
Oh,
that.
that's
So
interesting. Yeah.
so from a language design perspective, this is a really interesting choice overall for the language. We do not have first class functions. So all functions in Rego they have almost the same restrictions as rule heads do, where
Mm.
they're like a top level thing, and you cannot nest them in the sense of like defining a function within a function. You can't pass a function to a function. We don't even have like C style like function pointers where you can pass, you know, like a reference to a function to another function to execute it. We don't have that.
It
So
does that fall in the same logic like why we restrict recursion?
it's probably in the same general bucket. Like most of the reasons I can think of for like that, a lot of early technical decisions don't have documentation within the OPA project for why they were done the way they were.
Mm.
Um, but the best I can figure is probably for the same reason we don't support recursion, is just determining how likely a policy is to terminate. It's a whole lot easier when the policy itself can't be that complicated. Um, like what I mean by complicated in this context is like the control flow in the policy isn't complicated. Like you and I both have seen policies that have like thousands of rules in them. but are in terms of like how difficult is it to parse and understand for the interpreter slash compiler, like no, it's all fairly flat in terms of structure, which is nice. So like advantages from a language design perspective for not having first class functions, like the control flow analysis is really simple. There's barely any, right? It's everything is a tree structure. Versus in normal programming languages where you can have cycles, you can have potentially recursion, and that gets really nasty really quick. You have to have like a much more complex compiler just to even deal with like self-referencing or referencing functions that might be defined in another file. The ability to pass functions around means that you have to have like a more complex type system or other protective shenaniganry to keep things safe. Like it gets very ugly very quickly. And a lot of the guarantees that OPA gives just casually of, yeah, it's guaranteed that your policy will evaluate usually pretty fast, right? Those guarantees become a lot harder when the language itself is more flexible. So I think, if we're approaching OPA version 1, right, a lot of the decisions that have been made so far have ensured that while the language is maturing, we can make all those guarantees, about being fast, policies always terminate, and so on. It makes it easy for us to actually meet the things that we say that we do, but it does restrict us a bit. So, for OPA version 2, the Rego language might eventually grow the ability to have first-class functions, which would let us write really concise policies. But getting there would require dramatically more complex compiler machinery, right?
Yeah, I could see that.
So, like, I have ideas for how this would work, obviously. Like, I've thought about this, but it would not be a, like, a little, like, spend 2 or 3 days on it and you're done kind of deal. It would be much more involved. So yeah, I find it a bit of a straitjacket at times not having first class functions. And like I have seen people in the wild who write like their own rule preprocessors that like blast out a bunch of rules to implement stuff. But yeah.
Where did you come across those? Just like random projects on GitHub, or?
I've seen, I think there was one guy in Slack that did that a long while back. I don't know that he called it a preprocessor per se. And let's see, what was the other one? I think the other one was I was talking to someone in Styra who was really grumpy about not having like Boolean conditionals inside of rules. Because currently in Rego, you have to actually expand those out to separate rules most of the time, right? And this is actually something we're considering as a language extension in the future, is adding, nice Boolean conditionals, which I imagine internally we'll probably just rewrite that into separate rules that all nest under, the rule body appropriately. Like I have a vague idea of how that's going to work. I don't think it'll be super hard. It will take a little bit of time to get the subtleties right, but that's a language extension we can do. We just haven't had it for ages. And so I do remember running into someone in Styra who was considering writing their own little preprocessor just to make those conditionals nicer, because they were writing code that had like a deeply nested set of and or conditionals that was nasty.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm not sure why the Styra employee was doing it, so I can't really speak for that. But I feel like new users will sometimes look at like that conditional, like, oh, I want to like do this like imperative logic flow, where it's like if not this, then this, if not this, then this, and so they end up trying to build imperative logic into the language, and just it ends up getting really ugly really fast. Like I know I definitely tried it at one point.
I am as guilty of that as anyone when I was starting out. It's a logic language. Like it's a different whole mindset for how you need to make things happen, and there is a learning curve there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Cool. All right. Looks like we are at the top of the half hour. Good chatting.
Yeah.
Thanks
Looks
for
like
joining
the
the
office
office
hours
hours.
folks didn't show up, so oh well.
All right, next
All
week
right.
then. Cool, man.
Take
Talk
care,
to you later.
Peter.